The Broken Ridge Pass did not forgive mistakes. That was the first thing Sergeant First Class Elena Thorne noticed about the briefing slide. Somewhere between the third bullet point on enemy activity patterns and the satellite overlay that showed the pass as a thin scar cut through granite mountains that rose like broken teeth against a colorless sky. The briefing officer, a lieutenant colonel named Harov, with boots so clean they reflected the overhead lights, had said it with the practiced detachment of someone who would not be making the journey himself. The terrain does not forgive. Then he had advanced to the next slide with a click that echoed in the plywood briefing room like a door closing on something already decided. Standing at the back of the room with her rifle case propped against the wall beside her, Elena understood what he meant, not as metaphor, as physics, as the simple, brutal mathematics of elevation and exposure, in the way cold air moved through narrow spaces with enough force to strip heat from human bodies like paint from old wood. The Broken Ridge Pass was a slot canyon carved through the Korengal Range, roughly 400 meters wide at its narrowest point, flanked by vertical granite walls that climbed another 800 meters before leveling into snow-dusted ridgelines that disappeared into low cloud. Wind came through it not in steady, predictable currents, but in slabs of pressurized air that arrived without warning and hit like something solid. The temperature at 6,000 feet was minus 19 Celsius. By the time the convoy would stage at the southern approach just after dawn, ice crystals would already be forming on the rubber seals of optical equipment, on the exposed metal of rifle receivers, on the thin skin of human faces that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Elena stood apart from the ranger chalk as they filed out of the briefing room. She was attached. That was the word the operations officer had used when he introduced her to Captain Reed Macklin 3 days ago, speaking the syllable with a particular flatness that made it clear the arrangement was temporary and not entirely welcome. Attached to Bravo Troop, 3rd Ranger Battalion, as a precision fires asset for this particular operation. Her job was overwatch. Her weapon was a Shayak M300N chambered in 408, a rifle that in the right hands and the right atmospheric conditions could reach beyond 3 kilometers with enough retained energy to deliver lethal effect on human targets. She had carried it 2,000 meters over broken rock the previous night during the infiltration approach to Forward Operating Base Keller, and she had not complained once. Not when the straps cut into her shoulders, not when her boots lost purchase on scree slopes, and she had to catch herself with her free hand against stone so cold it burned through her glove. Not when the ranger in front of her, a staff sergeant whose name tape read Voss, had looked back with an expression that fell somewhere between skepticism and irritation, and said, "Keep up," in a tone that suggested he expected her not to. She was 29 years old. She had 3 combat deployments on her record and a service jacket that a general officer had once described during an award ceremony as exceptional, which was the kind of praise that sounded good in front of formation, but meant very little in the field, where the only thing that mattered was whether you could do the job when the job needed doing. She had 4 confirmed long-range kills, the farthest of which was 2,191 meters, achieved during her second deployment in a city whose name she was not permitted to speak in any official capacity. A shot that had taken her 3 minutes to set up, accounting for wind drift and the Coriolis effect, and the way heat rose from sun-baked concrete in waves that bent light like water bends the image of objects beneath its surface. A shot that had required her to calculate the precise moment when all variables aligned, and then trust that calculation enough to press a trigger and send a piece of machined, copper-jacketed lead on a trajectory that would intersect with a human being more than 2 kilometers away. That shot was her unit record. It was also, she understood from the way certain people looked at her during mission briefings, the outer limit of what they believed she was capable of. Not because the shot itself was in question. The ballistic data had been verified. The target confirmed. The tactical outcome documented in after-action reports that lived in classified databases where such things were cataloged and studied by people whose job was to extract lessons from violence. Number. The doubt lived in a different place, in the space between what had been done and what might be asked. In the question of whether a woman, even an exceptional one, could be relied upon when the distances grew longer and the stakes grew higher and the margin for error collapsed to something measured in fractions of a degree and single digits of wind speed. Staff Sergeant Garrett Voss made that doubt clear the next morning at the vehicle staging area. He was Bravo Troop's senior vehicle commander, a man in his late 30s with the kind of broad frame and loud voice that came from 18 years of never being contradicted by anyone who mattered. He had Gulf War deployment patches on his right shoulder and a combat infantryman badge above his ribbons, and a way of looking at equipment that suggested he was mentally calculating its tactical value and finding it insufficient. When he looked at Elena, she understood that in his calculation, her tactical value was somewhere below the spare tire mounted on the back of his MRAP. "You're the fires attachment," he said. Not a question, a statement that carried the weight of assessment already completed. "Sergeant First Class Thorne," she replied. "Yes." He looked at her rifle case, then at her, then at the ridge line that rose to the east of the staging area, like a wall built by something that predated human ambition. "This isn't a training range," he said. "I know," she replied quietly. He did not respond further. He turned to the first vehicle in the convoy and began running through his pre-combat checks with the methodical precision of someone who had done this enough times that the sequence had become autonomic. She watched him for a moment, then moved to the rear of the formation, where the last Humvee sat with its engine running and its exhaust creating small clouds in the frozen air. The convoy was 5 vehicles, 3 MRAPs with reinforced armor and mine-resistant V-hulls that could survive most improvised explosive devices if the placement was poor and the luck was good. 2 Humvees that were older and lighter and carried less protection but could navigate terrain the MRAPs could not. 18 Rangers plus her. Their objective was a logistics node 6 kilometers north of the pass, a confirmed weapons cache that Signals Intelligence had been tracking for 11 days through a combination of intercepted radio traffic and pattern of life analysis that showed consistent movement to and from a compound built into the side of a mountain where no legitimate business had any reason to exist. The plan was direct action at dawn. Move through the pass, hit the cache, extract before midday when the weather window would begin to close and helicopter support would become impossible. Clean, fast, decisive. The kind of operation that looked simple on a map and became complicated the moment human beings tried to execute it in terrain that had been killing people since before maps existed. Elena had read the operational plan 3 times. She had studied the satellite imagery until she could close her eyes and see the route traced in her mind like a scar. She had asked twice during planning sessions about drone reconnaissance over the ridgelines that flanked the pass at its midpoint, where the canyon narrowed to its tightest restriction and the walls rose highest, and the tactical problem of moving through a natural choke point became most acute. Both times she had been told that ISR assets were committed elsewhere. Priorities had been established at levels above the planning zone. The drone coverage they had would focus on the objective area and the immediate approach. The pass itself would rely on speed and the assumption that any enemy observation posts would be oriented north toward the objective, rather than south toward the route of approach that had been deliberately chosen for its reputation as impassable and therefore unwatched. She had identified a position on the eastern ridge anyway, a rock shelf visible in the satellite imagery, approximately 500 meters above the pass floor and 2 kilometers from the convoy's projected route at the midpoint transit. Natural defilade on 3 sides, perfect sightlines down the length of the canyon, the exact kind of position a competent enemy would use if they wanted to control the pass without exposing themselves to direct fire from the canyon floor. She had flagged it in her notes. She had brought it to the attention of Sergeant First Class Callum Briggs, the senior NCO who served as an advisor to Captain Macklin, and who carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing this job since before half the Rangers in Bravo Troop had been born. Briggs had looked at her notes, had studied the satellite image with the careful attention of someone who understood that terrain held secrets that only revealed themselves to people who knew how to look. He had nodded, had said, "Good eye," had told her he would mention it to the captain. But when the final briefing came and Captain Macklin walked through the scheme of maneuver with his laser pointer tracing routes on the projected map, the Eastern Ridge position had not been mentioned. No contingency for pre-positioned overwatch, no discussion of counter-sniper protocols. Just the convoy route and the objective and the extraction timeline and the confidence that came from men who had done this kind of thing before and survived and therefore believed they would survive again. Elena had not pushed. She was attached, not organic. A fire's asset brought in for a specific capability and expected to provide that capability when directed and otherwise remain out of the way. She understood the dynamics, understood that there was a difference between being technically correct about terrain analysis and being socially permitted to insist on that correctness when the people making decisions had rank and experience and a unit cohesion that she existed outside of. So she had kept her notes, had memorized the position, had calculated in her head the climbing route she would need to take to reach it, and the time that climb would require, and the fields of fire she would have once she arrived. All of it stored away like ammunition, kept ready for a weapon that might never be cleared to fire. The convoy began to move at 0612 hours. The first kilometer went smoothly in the way that things go smoothly when nothing has yet gone wrong. The road, if it could be called that, was compacted snow over broken rock, and the lead MRAP found it with the hesitant confidence of a vehicle whose driver was reading the surface in real time and making constant micro-adjustments to avoid the kind of mistake that would snap an axle or throw a track or send 2 tons of armored vehicles sliding sideways into a canyon wall. The sky had a low-pressure quality, a ceiling of gray-white cloud that sat on the ridgetops like something waiting. Snow had stopped falling during the night, but the air held the particular stillness that came before weather systems moved, that sense of pressure building against some invisible barrier that would eventually fail and release whatever violence the atmosphere had been storing. Elena rode in the back of the last Humvee with Private First Class Owen Hale, 19 years old and in his 3rd week of his first deployment. He was trying very hard not to look afraid, which meant he was failing at it in the way that everyone failed when they were very cold and the radio was crackling with transmissions that used words like "danger close," and the walls of a mountain pass were closing in on either side like the world was narrowing to a slot through which they had to thread themselves on faith that the slot would not close before they made it through. "You ever work with precision fires before?" Hale asked her. His voice carried the studied casualness of someone trying to make conversation to fill the silence that would otherwise be occupied by fear. "First time?" she asked. He nodded. His rifle lay across his lap, and his hands kept finding reasons to check it. Magazine seated, safety on, bolt forward. The nervous motions of someone who needed to touch something real to confirm that reality was still operating on principles he understood. "Don't worry," she said. "I'll try not to shoot you." He managed a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "That's good. I'd appreciate that." The radio crackled. "Ghost 6, this is Ghost 2. Vehicle 2 in position. Steady progress. Estimate arrival phase line Charlie in 12 mics." "Ghost 6 copies," came Captain Macklin's voice from the second vehicle. "All elements maintain interval. Comms check in sequence." The convoy continued north. The pass walls grew higher. The sky grew lower. Somewhere in the distance, Elena heard the sound that granite made when wind moved across it at certain angles. A low-frequency moan that was almost subsonic, something you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. At kilometer 2, the drone assigned to Bravo Troop lost signal. The ranger monitoring the feed in the third vehicle reported it with the flat affect of someone reading instrument failure from a checklist. Ghost 6, ISR is down. No visual. Sergeant First Class Briggs, whose voice on the radio carried the weight of experience measured in decades rather than years, keyed his handset. How long? Unknown. Signal drop clean. Could be terrain masking. Elena looked at the ridgeline to the east. The cliff face was sheer and dark, the kind of rock that had been compressed under impossible pressure until it became something harder than the forces that tried to break it. Snow clung to ledges in shadowed recesses where overhangs caught it and held it against the wind. Between the eastern and western walls, the convoy moved like something threaded through a needle, and Elena understood with sudden clarity that if someone wanted to stop them, this was where it would happen. She reached for her rifle case. Her hand was on the latch when Voss's voice came through on the vehicle net. Thorn, maintain position. I'm prepping my system, she said. We're still moving. You don't need your system while we're moving. She did not argue. She closed the case latch but kept her hand on it, and she kept her eyes on the eastern ridge where the rock shelf she had identified sat invisible from this angle, but present in her mind like a three-dimensional map she could rotate and examine from any perspective. 3 minutes later, the radio began to skip. Not full interference, just fractures in the transmission. Syllables that arrived broken and incomplete, as if someone had taken a recording of human speech and removed every third word. The communications operator in the lead vehicle reported it, and then the frequency shifted, and the fracture persisted on the new frequency too, which meant this was not equipment failure. This was active jamming, deliberate, targeted, and very close. Elena put her hand back on the rifle case. Ghost 6, she said on the net. I'm requesting permission to establish an overwatch position on the eastern wall. Elevation gain of approximately 60 meters would give me coverage of the saddle point at kilometer 3. I can be in position in 8 minutes. Silence on the net for 4 seconds. Long enough for her to hear her own heartbeat. Long enough to understand that the silence was not technical difficulty, but consideration. The sound of a commander weighing a request against doctrine and mission timelines, and the dozen other variables that lived in the space between what was tactically sound and what was operationally convenient. Then Captain Macklin's voice came back, and she heard in it the tone of a decision already made. Negative, Thorn. Distance to the saddle is 1,100 meters. Any contact point beyond that is out of your effective range. My effective range at this altitude and temperature is... I've read your file, he said, cutting her off. 2,191 meters confirmed. We're talking potential contact distances of 2,500 meters or more on the far ridgeline. You don't have that. She thought about correcting him, thought about explaining what the Shayak M300 could do in the right atmospheric conditions and in the hands of someone who understood long-range ballistics at altitude. Thought about her training data, her dope charts, the 3 years she had spent at the high-altitude precision fire school at Fort Carson, where she had made shots at distances that existed in the gap between manufacturer specifications and what was actually possible when you understood the physics deeply enough to bend them. She said none of it, because she understood that this was not about ballistics. This was about something harder to quantify, about the difference between what had been done and what might be attempted, about the risk calculation that happened in a commander's mind when the person asking for authorization was someone he had known for 3 days and whose presence in his unit was temporary and whose failure would reflect on his judgment in ways that would follow him longer than any success. Captain, she said, keeping her voice level, the jamming signature suggests we have someone running electronic warfare within 2 kilometers of our position. That's coordinated. Coordinated means command and control. Command and control means there's a designated fires controller somewhere on that ridgeline, with line of sight to the whole pass. Macklin was quiet for 2 seconds. That's speculation. It's tactical inference based on, you're the fire's attachment, Thorne, not the intel officer. Maintain position at rear vehicle. Out. The transmission ended with a particular silence that came from a conversation being terminated by authority rather than completion. Elena looked at Hale, who was watching her with the expression of someone trying to understand whether what he had just witnessed was normal or whether he should be worried. "Is something out there?" he asked quietly. "Not on the net, just one soldier to another in the back of a vehicle, moving through a canyon that felt like it was closing in around them with every meter traveled." Elena looked at the eastern ridgeline. Somewhere up there, 2,000 meters away, and perhaps 500 meters above them, was the position she had identified on the satellite image 3 days ago. A rock shelf with natural defilade on 3 sides, and sight lines that would give a competent enemy observer perfect coverage of the entire path. She had flagged it in her notes. She had brought it to Briggs's attention, and now they were driving past it with nothing but speed and hope, and the assumption that if an enemy was there, they would see the convoy in time to react. "Yes," she said to Hale, "I think there's something out there." Hale nodded slowly. His hand went to his rifle again, checking the magazine for the 3rd time in as many minutes. "What do we do?" "We stay sharp," she said. At kilometer 3, the lead MRAP rolled around a bend in the road and stopped. The driver's voice came through the net with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a problem without yet understanding its scope. "Tight. Obstruction. Large rocks on the road." Elena had her hand on the door handle before Macklin's acknowledgement came through the net. The rocks were not natural. She understood that the moment the lead vehicle's external camera feed came through on the shared tactical display that Briggs was monitoring from the second vehicle. 4 of them, each the size of a washing machine, arranged across the width of the road with mathematical precision. Rockfall looked nothing like this. Rockfall was chaos and dust and gradient, the signature of gravity acting on fractured stone with no intelligence behind it. This was placement. This was geometry. This was someone who understood that the most effective way to stop a convoy was not to destroy it, but to create a problem that required the convoy to stop itself while trying to solve it. She was out of the vehicle with her rifle case open before anyone ordered a halt. She heard Voss's voice behind her, sharp with authority and irritation. "Thorne, back in the vehicle." "I need a position," she said, not looking back, her hands already working the latches on the case. "Back in the vehicle, Sergeant First Class." "That is a direct order." She stopped, looked at the eastern ridge, looked at the rocks arranged across the road, looked at the geometry of the situation, and understood with the clarity that sometimes came in the seconds before violence that they were in the kill zone right now, that the rocks were not the threat, but the bait, and that somewhere up on that ridgeline, someone was watching through an optic and waiting for exactly this moment when the convoy was stationary and bunched and presenting the kind of target that existed in training manuals as the example of what not to do. She got back in the vehicle. She closed the door. She put her hand on her rifle case, and she counted seconds in her head while she waited for the thing she knew was coming. 18 seconds later, the mine beneath the lead MRAP's front axle detonated. The blast was not large. It was a pressure plate IED designed not to destroy, but to disable, to stop the lead vehicle and seal the front of the column while leaving the vehicle itself intact enough that the Rangers inside would survive the initial explosion and then have to dismount into whatever came next. The tactical logic of it was elegant in the way that well-executed violence was always elegant, and Elena recognized it even as the sound of the explosion was still echoing off the canyon walls, and the smoke was still rising in a column that looked black against the gray sky. This time, no one told her to get back in the vehicle. She was through the door with her rifle case in hand before the smoke finished rising, and she was moving east toward the cliff face, while behind her Rangers were dismounting and establishing sectors, and beginning to return fire on targets they could not yet see, but knew with absolute certainty were there. The first shots came from the east. Not a volley, a sequence. 4 shots in 4 seconds, spaced with the deliberate timing of people who had done this before and understood the value of fire discipline. In the opening seconds of an ambush, panic fired more bullets than training, but panic was ammunition, leaving the barrel with no guidance except fear. These shots had purpose. The first round struck the engine block of the second MRAP. Not the windshield where it might have been defeated by armored glass. Not the side panels where the angle might have caused deflection. The engine block, where a heavy caliber round could disable the vehicle's mobility and create a second obstacle that would further seal the convoy's forward movement. The second and third rounds hit the armored glass of the lead vehicle's cab. The glass held, but the impact was disorienting. Spiderweb cracks radiating from the impact points and rendering the driver effectively blind, which meant the lead vehicle was now disabled and the driver could not see, and the Rangers inside were trapped in a metal box that had just become a coffin if they stayed inside it. The fourth round hit Corporal Vincent Hayes in the left shoulder as he dismounted from the rear door of the third vehicle. Hayes went down hard, his rifle clattering against the road surface, but he did not lose consciousness. Elena saw him moving toward cover immediately, dragging himself with one arm toward the wheel well of the MRAP he had just exited. The fact that he could drag himself meant the bone was not completely shattered. The fact that he was moving at all meant he was still in the fight, even if he could no longer fire a weapon. She filed this information away in the part of her mind that tracked friendly casualties and assessed their impact on tactical capability, and understood that every Ranger who went down reduced their combat effectiveness by some percentage that could be calculated if you knew the math. More shots from the west. A secondary element at lower elevation, approximately 600 meters, working the side of the column from the blind spot created by the disabled lead vehicle. Staff Sergeant Vale, commanding the second Humvee, was hit by a fragment from a ricochet that cut his cheek open in a line that looked like someone had drawn it with a red marker. The shock of the impact and the blood that immediately began flowing caused 2 Rangers near him to break cover briefly, and one of them, Specialist Aaron Graves, took a round through the thigh that spun him around and put him on the ground in a position that meant the femoral artery might be compromised, and if it was, he had minutes before he bled out in the snow. 2 wounded in 90 seconds. Elena moved before she had finished forming a conscious plan. She went east and high, not into the open where she would draw fire, but along the base of the eastern cliff face, moving parallel to the road in the shadow of the rock, where the granite rose like a wall and created a narrow band of dead ground that offered concealment, if not cover. The stone was cold enough to pull heat from her glove on contact. She moved fast, staying low, her rifle case slung across her back, and her eyes scanning the rock face ahead for the route she had calculated in her mind 3 days ago when she first studied this terrain and understood that if she ever needed to reach the high ground, this was how she would do it. She needed elevation. She needed at least 40 meters of elevation gain to see over the curve of the road and into the rock shelf position she had identified on the satellite image. There was a rubble slope 70 meters ahead where a section of cliff face had fractured and collapsed sometime in the past decade, creating a ramp of broken granite that climbed at an angle steep enough to be difficult, but not steep enough to be impossible. It was not ideal. It was exposed on the west face, which meant that anyone watching from the western ridgeline would be able to see her climbing. But it was what the terrain offered, and in combat, you did not get to choose perfect positions. You got to choose between the position that existed and no position at all. She climbed. Her boots found purchase on rock edges that were sometimes solid and sometimes loose enough that small stones broke free and clattered down behind her in a sound that seemed impossibly loud against the background noise of gunfire that had now become continuous. Below her, Rangers were engaging targets on both ridgelines, firing controlled bursts that were meant to suppress rather than kill. because at these distances, with these weapons, they could not see what they were shooting at, only the general direction from which incoming fire originated. The wind hit her at the 30-meter mark, not the pulse gusts she had been experiencing at ground level. This was a sheer wind coming horizontally off the western ridge at approximately 18 miles per hour, carrying a load of fine ice crystals that immediately began to build on her weapon optics and on the exposed skin of her face. She blinked hard behind her eye protection and kept moving, because stopping meant cooling down, and cooling down meant her muscles would stiffen and her reaction time would slow, and she would become less effective at exactly the moment when effectiveness was the only thing that mattered. At 42 meters of elevation, she found a natural brace. Two slabs of rock that had fallen against each other during the ancient collapse and formed a triangular gap just wide enough for her elbows. She went prone on the rock, and the stone was so cold it felt like lying down on iron pulled from a freezer. She pressed her cheek against the stock of the M300 and looked through the scope. The scope was alive with ice crystal interference. She could see perhaps 60% of what she needed to see. The eastern ridge line showed as a dark, irregular line against the gray sky, and she could make out the general area of the rock shelf she had identified. But the detail was washed in white grain, the visual noise that came from atmospheric moisture freezing on the objective lens faster than body heat could melt it. She pulled a chem wipe from her chest rig and cleaned the ocular lens once. Better, not good, better. The improvement would last perhaps 90 seconds before the ice built up again, which meant she had 90 seconds to find what she was looking for, or she would have to clean again and lose time she might not have. She pulled her laser rangefinder from its pouch and pointed it at the rock shelf position she had identified. Held it steady for 3 seconds against the wind that was trying to push her aim point around. The display settled and showed a number that made something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. 2,890 meters. She swept left 20 degrees toward the area where the secondary muzzle flashes had been visible in her peripheral vision during the climb. The rangefinder pulsed. 598 meters. That was the western element. Close enough for the Rangers to handle if they could reorient their fires and close the distance. Not her problem. She moved the rangefinder back to the east and began sweeping the ridgeline methodically, section by section, using her knowledge of the satellite image to navigate toward the position she believed would give an enemy observer the best combination of concealment in fields of fire. The rangefinder pulsed on a rock formation 60 degrees north of her initial aim point. She held the laser on it and waited for the display to stabilize. 3,247 meters. She looked at the number for a long moment, feeling the wind on her left cheek and hearing the sound of gunfire below, and understanding that the distance between where she was and where that number pointed was greater than anything she had ever attempted outside of a training environment where missing meant starting over rather than dying. She put her eye back to the scope and found the position at 3,247 meters. The image was small, impossibly small, a dark mass against dark rock at a distance that translated to roughly 12 milliradians of angular subtension at this magnification. She could not identify a human figure. She could not identify anything with certainty, but she could identify the shape. The slightly asymmetric bulge on the right side of the rock shelf that had not been visible in the satellite image. The subtle geometry of something constructed rather than deposited. A hide. Someone was there. And that someone was coordinating the fires that were tearing into Bravo Troop below. She keyed her radio. Ghost 6, this is Thorne. I have a position. Captain Macklin's voice came back through her earpiece, and she could hear the strain in it, the sound of a man trying to maintain control while the situation deteriorated around him. Sit rep, I have observation position, East Ridge Line, 42 meters elevation. Target identified at 3,247 meters. Suspected command element. A pause, long enough that she thought the transmission might have been lost to the jamming, that was still fracturing radio communications into broken syllables. Then his voice came back, careful and measured in the way that people spoke when they were choosing words that would matter later. Repeat that distance. 3,247 meters. I'm looking at a constructed hide site at that range. The jamming origin is consistent with this location. If there's a fire control element coordinating this ambush, that's where it is. Another pause. She could hear gunfire through his earpiece now, not hers. The ambient sound of the firefight below bleeding through his radio before he transmitted. She did not look down. She kept her eye in the scope, watching the dark shape at 3,247 meters for any sign of movement. That's beyond capability, Thorne. She had expected this, had known from the moment she saw the rangefinder reading that this conversation was coming, had rehearsed in her mind the words she would use to explain that manufacturer specifications were conservative by design, that the Shayak M300's maximum effective range was not a hard ceiling, but a statistical probability curve, that at altitude with proper atmospheric corrections, the weapon system was capable of delivering lethal effects well beyond the 2,000-meter figure that appeared in the technical manual. No, sir, she said, it is not. The Shayak's maximum effective range specification is 2,000 meters. That is a marketing figure designed for liability protection. At altitude with correct atmospheric doping and confirmed ballistic data, this system is capable of lethal effect at this range. I have confirmed impact data from my own shooting at ranges in excess of 3,000 meters at the Fort Carson high-altitude facility. This is not a range, he said. No, sir, it is not. Silence for 3 seconds. She could feel the wind on her left cheek, steady pressure from the west, a reference point she was using to gauge atmospheric conditions at her elevation. The wind at the target elevation would be different, stronger probably, coming from a slightly different angle. She would have to estimate it based on snow displacement patterns she could barely see through the scope interference. Thorne, you are not clear to fire at this time. Await instruction. Below, she heard a sound she recognized without looking. The flat crack of a precision rifle from the eastern ridgeline. Not the scattered fire of suppression or panic. A single shot, aimed and deliberate. Someone down there had just been hit by someone up here who was choosing targets with care and shooting with the kind of accuracy that came from training and good equipment in a stable firing position. She did not look down. She kept her eye in the scope. She thought about the order she had just been given, thought about what it meant to disobey a direct order from a commanding officer during an active engagement. The legal consequences were real and not trivial. Article 92 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Failure to obey order or regulation. Maximum punishment, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, 2 years confinement. She thought about Staff Sergeant Voss looking at her at the staging area with an expression that said she did not belong here. She thought about Captain Macklin reading her file and saying 2,191 meters confirmed with the tone of someone stating a fact that was also a limitation. She thought about Specialist Graves on the ground with a round through his thigh, bleeding into snow that was already red. She thought about Hale, 19 years old, third week in country, trying not to look afraid. She thought about Sergeant Liam Korber, Syria, 14 months ago, a city whose name she could not speak in official contexts, but whose streets she could still navigate in her mind with perfect clarity. She had been providing overwatch for a patrol moving through a neighborhood where intelligence suggested the presence of a high-value target. The target had appeared on a rooftop at 1,847 meters. A long shot, but not extreme, well within the capability envelope of her weapon system and her training. She had calculated the wind at 12 miles per hour based on visible indicators at her elevation. Flags hanging from balconies, dust movement in the street, the way heat shimmer moved across her sight picture. She had made her corrections and taken her shot and watched through the scope as the round passed half a meter to the left of the target, who dropped behind cover and disappeared. 20 minutes later, the patrol she was covering took fire from a different position. An improvised explosive device detonated beneath the lead vehicle. Sergeant Liam Corver, her spotter, her friend, a man who was 28 years old and engaged to be married and planning to leave the Army after his deployment to start the family he talked about during the long hours of waiting that made up most of their time together, was killed instantly by the blast. His last words on the radio, transmitted in the seconds before the explosion reached him, were about wind. "Reeves, the wind just shifted. We need to recalculate." And then static. And then nothing. And then the voice of another soldier reporting the casualty with the flat affect that came from training designed to keep people functional when everything inside them wanted to shut down. She had missed the wind call. Not by much. The actual wind speed had been 16 miles per hour, not 12. A difference of 4 miles per hour over 1,847 meters translated to a missed distance of 0.8 meters. Close enough to see the impact, far enough to matter. The target had survived. Corver had not, and the mathematics of that exchange had lived in her chest ever since, like a weight she carried separate from her equipment. Every shot after that had been different. Every wind call triple-checked. Every atmospheric variable examined from multiple angles. Every calculation confirmed and reconfirmed until the certainty was absolute. Because missing was no longer just a training failure or an embarrassment or a mark on a qualification card. Missing was Corver on the radio saying they needed to recalculate. Missing was the silence that came after. Briggs's voice came through on a private channel, quiet and steady. "Thorne, I'm watching your position. I know what you're looking at." "Copy," she said. "I also know what Macklin just told you." "Copy." She could hear him breathing on the radio, could hear in the background the sound of him moving, probably taking cover behind his vehicle, probably scanning the ridge lines with his own optic, trying to see what she was seeing. "I can't give you an order," he said. "I'm not in your chain of command for this operation. But I'm going to tell you what I see. I see a coordinated ambush that's tearing us apart. I see jamming that's compromising our communications. I see fires coming from multiple positions, with discipline that suggests command and control. And I see you on that ridge with a shot that nobody else can take." She did not respond, kept her breathing steady, kept her eye in the scope. "You take that shot, you're disobeying a direct order. That goes in your record. That follows you. That could end your career. I know. But if you don't take it, we might not have careers to worry about." The logic was clean. The kind of tactical calculus that made sense when you reduced it to pure mathematics. Rangers were dying below. The enemy command element was coordinating the fires that were killing them. Eliminating that command element would disrupt the coordination and create an opportunity for Bravo Troop to maneuver out of the kill zone. The shot was possible. Difficult, but possible. The consequences of taking it were certain. The consequences of not taking it were probable, but worse. She settled her breathing. 4 count in, 4 count hold, 4 count out. The rhythm slowed her heart rate and steadied her hands and created the physiological conditions that made precision possible. She was aware of her heart beating at roughly 70 beats per minute. She would time the shot to the rest phase between beats, the cardiac valley where her body was briefly not in motion, where the micro movements of blood pumping through vessels would not translate to scope movement. She began the ballistic calculation. The Shayak M300 firing a 305-grain solid projectile at a muzzle velocity of 915 meters per second. At 3,247 meters, the bullet would be in the air for approximately 3.1 seconds. In those 3.1 seconds, the world would continue moving. The wind would push the bullet. The earth would rotate beneath it. Gravity would pull it down in a parabolic arc that required compensation. The target was at an elevation approximately 580 meters above her current position, creating a shooting angle of roughly 10 degrees. At this distance and angle, she was not just shooting through different atmospheric conditions, but into them. The wind at her elevation was 18 miles per hour from the west. The wind at the target elevation, based on snow movement patterns she could barely discern through the scope, was stronger, 24 miles per hour, possibly as high as 26. At a crosswind component of 24 miles per hour, sustained over 3,247 meters of flight path, the wind drift would be substantial. She estimated 2.4 meters of lateral deflection from wind alone, plus additional Coriolis correction for this latitude and azimuth, plus atmospheric density correction for the altitude and temperature. The air at 19 degrees below zero was denser than standard atmosphere, which meant the bullet would retain velocity better, but also experience more drag in the early phase of flight. She had all of this in her head, had been doing these calculations since she was a private at sniper school, reducing them over 12 years until they were not calculations exactly, but something more like fluency. Like reading. You did not read by sounding out letters. You read by meaning. She did ballistics by meaning. The hold was 4.7 milliradians elevation and 3.1 milliradians windage. She dialed 3.8 milliradians of elevation into the scope turret, feeling each click under her gloved fingers. The rest she would hold mentally, using the reticle pattern in the scope as a reference grid, and placing her aim point at a position that existed not where the target was, but where the intersection of bullet trajectory and target location would occur 3.1 seconds in the future. She set the mental reference for the wind hold on the left edge of the rock formation she could see, a dark, vertical line that would serve as her aiming stake. Then she put her eye back to the scope and waited. The wind dropped. Not completely, not gone, but it paused in the particular way mountain winds sometimes pause between one cycle and the next. A brief hesitation in the atmosphere as the pressure differential that drove the wind reached some temporary equilibrium. She felt it as a reduction in the pressure on her left cheek. 2 seconds, maybe 3. That was all. That was enough. She let her body go still in a way that was difficult to describe to people who had never done it. Not tensed, not relaxed, but suspended, like a clock at the exact moment between ticks. Her heartbeat was there but slow, and she timed everything to the valley between beats, when her body was briefly not a system of pumping blood and expanding lungs, but just mass held steady by will. She looked at the hide. The shape moved again, a definite repositioning, someone adjusting something. She could not see details, but she could see movement, and movement meant living presence. And living presence at that location meant the person coordinating the ambush that was killing the rangers she had been sent here to protect. She centered the crosshairs 3.1 milliradians west of the shape, 4.7 milliradians elevated from it. Using the mental picture she had built of the hold, trusting 12 years of training and the mathematics that lived in her mind like a language she spoke fluently, she took a half breath, let half of it out. Her finger was already on the trigger, not pressing but resting with a pressure so light it was closer to touch than force. She felt the trigger face through the glove, felt the point of contact where intention would become action. She pressed. The M300 fired. The muzzle blast was immense, a pressure wave that traveled outward in all directions and created a visible cloud of white gas in the negative 19-degree air. The cloud obscured her view for a fraction of a second before the cold wind swept it clear, and she stayed on the glass, kept her eye in the scope, watching the hide at 3,247 meters, while the bullet traveled the distance between them. 1 second. The bullet was somewhere in flight, traveling at approximately 600 meters per second at this point in its trajectory, following the arc she had calculated, being pushed by wind she had estimated, falling under gravity she had compensated for. 2 seconds, still traveling. Somewhere in the darkness between her position and the target, a piece of machined copper and lead was moving through air molecules and being affected by forces she could not see, but had accounted for in the mathematics that put it on this path. 3 seconds. The shape in the hide moved. Not the repositioning shift of a moment ago. This was different. This was a collapse. Sudden and asymmetric. The way a sandbag collapsed when the sand found a way out. The upper part of the shape fell inward. The equipment she had seen as a dark mass, a radio or a spotting scope, moved with it, toppling, then settling into stillness. She stayed on the glass, waited, watched the hide for secondary movement, for any indication that there was another person there, that the collapse had been something other than what it appeared to be. Nothing. The hide remained still. The shape did not move again. She keyed her radio, and her voice was steady in a way that surprised her. Shot out. Target hit. East Ridge Line, 3,247 meters. Confirming. No one responded for a long moment. The silence on the net stretched until it became its own kind of sound. The absence of communication that meant everyone was processing what she had just said and trying to reconcile it with what they knew about distances and capabilities, and the woman who had just claimed to have done something that existed at the edge of possible. Then Briggs's voice came back, flat and professional in the way that senior NCO spoke when they were managing a tactical situation that required immediate action, regardless of how they felt about it. Copy, Thorne. Confirm hit. Eyes on ridgeline. The effect was not immediate. This was not cinema where the death of one person caused the immediate dissolution of an opposing force. The ambush continued for 40 seconds after the shot, but it continued differently. The rhythm changed. From the eastern ridgeline, the fire became irregular. Shots spaced unevenly, the signature of a team that had lost its coordination reference. A fire control element in an ambush of this complexity was not merely shooting. It was sequencing, directing, shifting priority of fires between the eastern and western elements to create maximum effect on the column below. Without that direction, each shooter fell back on individual judgment. An individual judgment in a confused engagement was almost always conservative. The frequency of eastern fire dropped by roughly 60% in the first 30 seconds after her shot. The Rangers on the ground noticed. She could hear it in the radio traffic, the shift from defensive urgency to offensive possibility. Someone, probably Briggs, was already issuing movement orders. All Bravo elements, suppression shift east, 3-round bursts, suppress and advance to reference point Charlie. The western element, which had been responding to coordinated cues from the eastern fire control position, went intermittent, then ceased entirely. Whether they withdrew or went to ground, the effect was the same. The left flank of the column stabilized. The Rangers had room to maneuver. On the eastern ridge, the surviving members of the ambush element made a decision Elena recognized from the pattern of fire. They were withdrawing. Short bursts every 20 seconds, the signature of a bounding withdrawal, where men moved in alternating teams while others provided covering fire. They were not running. They were professionals executing a tactical withdrawal correctly. But they were withdrawing. She tracked them briefly through the scope. She had one shot she could have taken, a figure at approximately 800 meters visible for perhaps 3 seconds in a gap in the ridgeline. She did not take it. The tactical situation had shifted. That man withdrawing was no longer the priority threat. The priority was below her, where Rangers were wounded and needed treatment, and the convoy needed to reorganize and begin movement before the weather window closed entirely. She came off the rock and moved back down the rubble slope. The descent was faster than the climb, and she took it in controlled falls, using the rifle as a counterbalance, letting momentum carry her down sections that would have required careful climbing on the way up. She reached the road surface in under 2 minutes. Graves was propped against the wheel well of the third vehicle, a combat tourniquet applied to his thigh and cinched tight enough that the bleeding had stopped, but his face had gone very white. His eyes were open and tracking, though, which meant he was still conscious and aware and processing what was happening around him. Hale was next to him, holding pressure on a secondary bleed point below the tourniquet, his hands red with blood that looked black in the gray light. Hale looked up at Elena when she arrived. "You shot someone," he said. The tone was not accusatory. It was the tone of someone trying to calibrate reality, trying to understand whether what he thought had just happened had actually happened. "Yes," she said. Hayes was being moved to the 2nd MRAP by the troop medic, Sergeant First Class Daniela Reyes. His shoulder wound had gone through and through, missing bone but tearing muscle in a way that Reyes had described on the net as workable but ugly. He was ambulatory, though his left arm hung useless, and his face carried the particular pallor of someone in shock trying to maintain function through force of will. Captain Macklin found Elena beside the vehicle. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Around them, Rangers were moving with the focused efficiency of the immediate post-contact period. Casualty collection, security establishment, vehicle assessment. All the procedures that existed because someone had learned the hard way what happened when you forgot to do them. "That's shot," he said finally. "Yes, sir." Another moment of silence. She could see him working through something, some calculation that involved what she had done and how she had done it and what it meant for the situation they were in, and the situation he would have to manage when they returned to base and began the administrative process that followed any engagement where orders were disobeyed and results were achieved. "I'll need to document it," he said. "Yes, sir." He looked at the eastern ridgeline, at the distance, at the space between where she had been and where the target had been. He said nothing else, turned and moved back toward the command vehicle, where Briggs was already coordinating the next phase of movement. The helicopter could not come. The weather system that had been holding at the northern approach to the pass moved south with the speed that high-altitude weather systems sometimes moved. 15 minutes between manageable and impossible. By the time Reyes had Hayes and Graves stabilized for movement, the ceiling had dropped 300 meters, and the wind speed at the designated landing zone coordinates was 41 knots. The Air Mission Coordinator gave it to them straight on the radio, his voice carrying the regret of someone who understood what no air support meant, but could not change the physics of rotary wing flight in conditions where rotor wash would create brownout and wind shear would make controlled descent impossible. No rotary wing until conditions improve. Estimate 2 to 3 hours. Macklin made the decision without hesitation, and Elena respected him for that. The ability to accept bad options and choose the least bad without delay was a quality that separated competent commanders from dangerous ones. We move south on foot, leave the disabled vehicle, 45-minute movement to the southern staging area. The road was not viable for the remaining vehicles. The IED had created a crater that made the first 100 meters impassable, and the rockfall obstruction remained in place behind them. On foot, in snow, carrying 2 casualties, with an unknown number of adversary elements still somewhere in the terrain. It was not a good option. It was the only option. Elena took rear guard. This was where she had started, at the back of the formation. But the position meant something different now. Rear guard in a movement under potential pursuit was a critical role, not a dismissal. It required someone who could move independently, maintain situational awareness, and engage threats without requiring constant supervision. Macklin had not discussed the assignment with her. He had simply looked at her after issuing movement orders and said, "Thorn, rear guard, 30 meters separation," and she had understood that this was acknowledgement of a kind that did not require words. She moved at 30 meters behind the last element of the main body, scanning back the way they had come, watching for movement in the upper terrain, checking the road surface for disturbances that might indicate hasty emplacement of secondary devices. The snow was falling again, not heavy but steady, the kind of precipitation that would cover tracks within an hour and reduce visibility to a few hundred meters. At the 20-minute mark, she saw them, 2 figures approximately 1 kilometer back along the road surface. They were moving south, following the same route Bravo Troop was using, maintaining what looked like tactical spacing. Whether they were remnants of the Western element who had gone to ground rather than withdrawn, or a pursuit element from the Eastern ridgeline, she could not determine from this distance. What she could determine was their pace, which was faster than the main body's movement rate, limited as it was by the speed of the litter carry. She keyed her radio. "Ghost 6, this is Thorn. 2 elements behind us, approximately 1 kilometer, closing." Macklin's response came back immediately. "Can you interdict?" She looked at the terrain. The road curved here, and the 2 figures were visible through a gap in the curb that would close as the angle changed. She had perhaps 90 seconds before the geometry shifted and they disappeared behind rock. She went prone in the snow. No rock pile this time, no elevated position, just the road surface, which was compacted ice over gravel that pulled heat from her body the moment she made contact. She settled the rifle and found the 2 figures in the scope. 860 meters. Difficult conditions, but not extreme range. She was cold and tired, and her hands had lost some of their precision in the temperature and the exertion of the climb and descent. She knew this. She accounted for it in the same way she accounted for wind and distance, adding a small margin to her hold to compensate for the degradation in her own performance. She shot the lead figure's center mass. The recoil pushed her back slightly against the ice, and she recovered and tracked to find the second figure. He had already reacted, diving to the side of the road with the speed of someone who understood what the sound of incoming fire meant. She tracked him for 3 seconds as he reached cover behind a boulder that jutted from the road cut. She held her crosshairs on the position. He did not come back out. She got up and moved south, checking behind her periodically to verify that the second figure remained in cover. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility and creating the kind of atmospheric conditions that made long-range shooting increasingly difficult. She did not mind. It worked both ways. If she could not see potential threats clearly, potential threats could not see her clearly either. At kilometer 3.8 of the withdrawal, Voss fell. Not from a gunshot, from terrain. A section of road surface that had been undermined by snowmelt and then frozen had cracked under his weight, and his right leg had gone through to the knee. The jagged ice edge had cut into his lower leg significantly, a wound that was not life-threatening, but was definitely not ambulatory. He had been moving at the back of the main body, 30 meters ahead of Elena, and she arrived at the same moment as 2 other rangers moved to help him. She saw the evaluation in their eyes, the quick situational calculus. They already had 2 casualties on litters. 3 was a different problem. 3 was a question of load distribution and movement speed, and whether everyone made it out or whether someone got left behind with a radio and a promise to come back when conditions allowed. She slung her rifle across her back. "I've got him," she said. She put Voss's arm across her shoulders. He was 6'2" and 220 pounds. She was 5'7" and 140. And the next kilometer and a half was not easy. She remembered every step of it later, not as a clear, linear sequence, but as a series of sensations. The weight across her shoulders, the cold air in her lungs, the sound of Voss's breathing beside her ear, which was pained and controlled in equal measure. The breathing of someone who had been trained to maintain discipline even when hurt. Halfway through, his voice came quiet beside her ear. "I was wrong about you." She did not respond immediately. She was focusing on foot placement, on the rhythm of movement, on the management of effort across distance. "Save it for the after-action review," she said finally. His weight shifted slightly, an attempt to help her balance. She felt it and understood it as an acknowledgement of a different kind, the physical equivalent of an apology. At the southern staging area, she handed him to Reyes and did not look back at his expression. She knew what it would be, had seen it before on the faces of men who had made judgments about capability based on assumptions, and then had those assumptions proven wrong in ways that could not be dismissed or explained away. She did not need to see it again. The snow came heavy at the staging area, Not the light crystal fall of early morning, but genuine snowfall, the kind that covered things. Within 20 minutes, the road into the pass was invisible. Within 30, the shapes of the disabled vehicles at the northern end were lost to the weather. The firefight was 2 hours behind them, and it was already becoming a different country, a place that existed now only in memory and radio logs, and the wounds carried by the men who had been there. Rangers settled into the staging area with the quiet purpose of people in the aftermath of violence. Casualties were managed with the clinical efficiency that training provided when emotion would have been counterproductive. Security positions were established on the perimeter, fields of fire designated, sectors of responsibility assigned. Equipment was accounted for with a kind of inventory discipline that seemed pedantic until you understood that in environments like this, a missing piece of gear could mean the difference between functional and compromised. The rituals of unit maintenance in the field gave structure to the time and kept hands occupied. People talked less than they normally would have. Not from grief exactly, because Hayes and Graves were stable, and Voss was mobile, even if he was limping, but from the particular exhaustion that came from sustained fear, now metabolized into the body as something chemical and depleting. Elena sat apart from the main group, not isolated. She maintained visual contact with the security positions and had her radio on, monitoring the command net for any change in situation or timeline. But she positioned herself at a remove that she had not chosen consciously and was not entirely sure she could account for if someone asked. It felt necessary in a way that went beyond tactical consideration. A physical distance that matched some internal requirement for space to process what had happened without the pressure of observation. Briggs came and sat beside her after a while. He was a man in his early 40s with a kind of lean build that came from decades of physical work rather than gymnasium training. He had a quietness about him that was different from Macklin's command presence and different from Voss's aggressive certainty. His quiet came from experience deep enough that he no longer needed to prove he had it. He looked at the pass entrance, now invisible behind the falling snow, for a long moment before he spoke. "That shot is going to get documented," he said. His voice was conversational, factual. "I know you disobeyed a direct order to take it." Elena did not respond immediately. She was watching the snow fall, watching the way it accumulated on the equipment scattered around the staging area, softening the hard edges of military hardware into shapes that looked almost geological. "You were right about the jamming," Briggs continued. Intel confirmed it in the debrief prep communications with battalion. There was a command and control element at the eastern position. Electronic warfare capability, fire control coordination, the whole package, exactly what you said. She still did not answer. The wind had shifted slightly, coming now from the north rather than the west, carrying the smell of snow and stone and the particular emptiness of high-altitude air. "The distance will need to be verified," he said. "Your rangefinder reading versus confirmed GPS coordinates of the position once we can get imagery assets back over the area. Standard procedure for any engagement at extended range." "I know," she said. Briggs nodded slowly. He pulled a canteen from his kit and took a drink, then offered it to her. She accepted it and drank, the water so cold it hurt her teeth. "The rangefinder will be right," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded again, was quiet for another moment, and in that moment, Elena understood that he was choosing his words with the same care she had used, choosing her whole point on the shot. He was calibrating something, deciding what needed to be said and what could remain unspoken. "Nice shot, Thorne," he said finally. Then he stood and walked back toward the command vehicle where Macklin was coordinating with battalion on revised extraction timelines. Elena sat alone again and listened to the radio traffic. Macklin's voice talking to the battalion operations center, his words clipped and professional as he walked through the engagement sequence. She caught fragments, casualty report, fire's asset, confirmed effects at range, and then a pause, and then standby for distance verification. The operations center came back. She did not hear the words, but she heard the tone, the particular cadence of a headquarters element that had just received information it found noteworthy enough to require confirmation. Macklin's voice again, measured and deliberate. Roger that. Copy all. 3,247 confirmed. The snow kept falling. The pass filled in behind them, accumulating in layers that would eventually bury the evidence of the firefight under white that looked clean and new and entirely indifferent to what had happened beneath it. Elena looked at the sky. The gray ceiling was lowering further, settling toward the mountaintops with the weight of weather systems that had nothing to do with human timelines, or extraction windows, or the need for helicopter support. She was very cold and very tired, and she thought that this was probably the quietest she would feel for a long time. There would be debriefs and documentation and questions from people who had not been there about decisions made by people who had. There would be conversations about effective range and manufacturer specifications and the difference between training results and combat application. There would be administrative processes that would take what had happened in 3.1 seconds and expand it into forms and reports and recommendations that would follow her through whatever came next. But right now, in this moment, sitting in the snow at a staging area while the weather closed in around them, she felt a kind of stillness that was different from the stillness she had cultivated on the ridge. This was not the suspended animation of the body preparing to fire. This was something more like acceptance. The understanding that she had done what needed doing and that the consequences would be what they would be, and that worrying about them now would change nothing. The Battalion Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Keller ran a shift change at 1600 hours. The incoming watch officer, Captain Samantha Drury, received the handover brief from her predecessor in the standard format. Current operations, pending reports, personnel updates, intelligence summaries. The information presented in the efficient shorthand that headquarters elements use when communicating among themselves, assuming shared context and common understanding of the acronyms. She received it standing with coffee in hand, mentally cataloging the items that would require her attention during her shift and filing away the items that were informational only. She was ready to move on when her predecessor, First Lieutenant Cord Ramsey, reached the fires report. She stopped moving when she heard the numbers. "Read that back," she said. Ramsey looked at his tablet, and his expression suggested he had been waiting for this reaction. "Precision Fires Asset, Bravo Troop. Confirmed lethal effect at 3,247 meters. Rangefinder confirmed against GPS coordinates." Drury set down her coffee with the care of someone who needed both hands free to think clearly. "That's a world record," she said. "It may be," Ramsey said. He had the expression of someone who had been looking at the number for 2 hours and had not fully made peace with what it implied. The official record for a confirmed sniper kill held by a Canadian warrant officer in 2017 was 3,540 meters, a shot that had taken the shooting community more than a decade to surpass, and that still sat in the public record as something close to an engineering problem solved rather than a purely human act of marksmanship. What Sergeant First Class Thorne had done was not at that extreme distance, but it existed within the territory of distances so large they stopped feeling like marksmanship in the traditional sense and started feeling like something else, like applied physics, like mathematics made manifest in the physical world, like the kind of capability that required explanation because it sat beyond what most people believed possible. Drury pulled up the raw report on her own tablet and read it carefully. Read the atmospheric conditions, minus 19 Celsius. Estimated crosswind 18 to 24 miles per hour. Shooting angle 10 degrees elevated. Target elevation gain 580 meters. She did rough ballistic calculations on a notepad, working through the holdover and wind drift and time of flight, and arrived at numbers that were demanding but plausible, given the right equipment and the right atmospheric window and the right person behind the rifle. She forwarded the report to the battalion commander with a subject line that read, "Recommend review fires report, Bravo Troop 0800 local." Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the number again and thought about what it meant that a sergeant first class with 3 deployments had just done something that existed at the edge of human capability while simultaneously disobeying a direct order from her commanding officer. The problems that created were not simple. The excellence and the disobedience existed in the same action, inseparable. And the Army's systems for documentation and recognition were not designed to handle situations where both were true simultaneously. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Vance, battalion commander, read the report at 16:23 hours. He was a man in his late 40s who had commanded at every level from platoon to battalion and understood that combat created situations that could not be adequately captured in the forms designed to document them. He read through the engagement sequence twice, paying attention to the timeline and the communication logs, and the specific language Macklin had used when describing Thorne's actions. He called Macklin directly on a secure line. The captain answered from the staging area with the background noise of movement and preparation audible behind his voice. "Captain," Vance said, "walk me through this engagement." Macklin did. He presented the information with professional detachment, not minimizing the chaos or the casualties or the communications breakdown that had left them operating in a degraded command and control environment. He also did not minimize the disobedience. He described Thorne's request for Overwatch position, his denial of that request, her unauthorized movement, his order to hold fire, her decision to engage anyway. He presented all of it with the same flat precision, making clear that he was providing facts rather than interpretation, understanding that his job was to give the commander the information needed to make decisions, rather than to make those decisions himself. "She disobeyed a direct order," Vance said when Macklin finished. "She disobeyed my direct order," Macklin confirmed. "Yes, sir." "And your assessment?" There was a long pause. Elena, listening to her radio from across the staging area, could hear the silence stretching out as Macklin considered his answer. She understood what he was weighing, the tension between what had been ordered and what had been achieved, the question of whether results justified methods or whether methods mattered independent of results. "Sir," Macklin said finally, "she was right about the terrain analysis. She was right about the enemy position. She was right about the threat assessment. The engagement broke when that command element was eliminated. The tactical situation shifted immediately in our favor. She preserved the column." He paused, and Elena heard him take a breath. "But she disobeyed," he said. "That is also a fact that exists independent of the outcome." Vance was quiet for a moment. "How the hell do I document this, Captain?" "I don't know, sir," Macklin said honestly. "I've been trying to figure that out for the last 2 hours." The report, when it finally circulated at division level the following morning, used careful language. It described the engagement in factual terms, noting that precision fires were delivered at extended range, resulting in confirmed enemy killed in action and subsequent disruption of enemy command and control capabilities. It used the phrase uncoordinated fires in the summary, which was a way of indicating that the fires had been delivered without explicit authorization, while avoiding the more direct language of disobedience or insubordination. A division fires officer read the report and attached a note recommending ballistic verification and formal documentation as possible world-class marksmanship performance. Someone else, no one ever determined exactly who, used the phrase "mountain pass miracle" in an informal message. The phrase attached itself to the engagement report with the tenacity that informal phrases had in bureaucratic systems, becoming shorthand for something that could not be easily categorized. By 2200 hours, Elena was sitting in the plywood dining facility at FOB Keller, eating reheated beef stew and drinking black coffee that had been sitting on the warming plate long enough to develop the bitter edge that came from overheating. The facility was mostly empty, Just a few rangers from other units finishing late meals or starting early ones, depending on their shift schedules. Voss walked in. He was moving carefully, favoring his right leg, the bandage visible under his pant leg where the medics had dressed the wound. But he was moving under his own power, which meant the damage had been manageable and the treatment effective. He got food from the serving line and sat down across from her without asking permission. For a moment, they both looked at their trays. The food was standard deployed rations, the kind of meal that provided calories and basic nutrition without pretending to provide anything resembling pleasure. They ate in silence for several minutes. "You carried me," Voss said finally. "Kilometer and a half." Elena did not look up from her tray. "You needed carrying." He ate another spoonful of stew, set down his fork, looked at the tabletop as if the wood grain contained information he needed to read carefully. "I told you this wasn't a training range," he said. "You did," she confirmed. Another silence. He was not a man who apologized easily. She could see that in the way the words were arranging themselves behind his expression. The visible effort of someone trying to find language for something he was not accustomed to articulating. "I was wrong," he said, "about your capability, about what you could do." She looked at him then, understanding that this cost him something to say. "I've been doing this 18 years, he continued. "Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. I've worked with a lot of people, some exceptional, some adequate, some neither. I looked at you at the staging area and I made a judgment based on assumptions I didn't examine." He paused. "I saw someone I thought would be a liability, someone we'd have to accommodate rather than someone who would contribute. And I was wrong about that, completely wrong." Elena set down her fork. "You know what the hardest distance was today, Sergeant?" He waited. "It wasn't 3,247 meters. It was the distance from the back of your convoy, where you put me because you didn't think I belonged, to that rubble slope where I had to prove I did. That distance I had to cover alone, without support, without acknowledgement, just me and the certainty that if I was right and you were wrong, I'd still have to carry the consequences of proving it." She paused. "The bullet went where the math said it would go. That's physics. But crossing from attachment to Ranger in your eyes? That required more than ballistics. It required you to see past what you expected to see. And I couldn't do that for you. You had to do that yourself." Voss was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried something that might have been respect, or might have been understanding, or might have been both. "You're right," he said. "And for what it's worth, you're not in attachment anymore. Not to me. Not to anyone in Bravo Troop who was in that pass." He stood, picking up his tray. "Welcome to the team, Thorne." The weather broke at 0400. Elena was not asleep when it happened. She had slept for perhaps 2 hours in the temporary quarters building and woken at 0330, which was a pattern she had developed across 3 deployments and had long since stopped fighting. Some part of her remained calibrated to the operational rhythm, even when there were no immediate operations, maintaining a state of partial alertness that made sustained rest difficult. She was sitting outside the temporary quarters on a concrete step when she felt the barometric pressure change. A subtle shift in the way the cold air felt against her face. A reduction in the loaded quality of the sky. It was not something that could be seen or heard, but something that registered at a level below conscious observation. The body's understanding of atmospheric physics operating faster than the mind could process. By 0415, stars were visible at the northern horizon, small points of light appearing in gaps in the cloud cover as the weather system that had locked down the valley began to break apart and move on. She sat and looked at them for a while, these distant nuclear furnaces whose light had traveled across space for years, or decades, or centuries to arrive at this particular moment and illuminate this particular patch of Afghan mountainside where she sat thinking about distances. The evacuation flights would begin at first light. Hayes and Graves would go to the surgical facility at Bagram, where their wounds would be properly treated and their recovery would begin. Voss would go to the same facility for his leg. The rest of Bravo Troop would begin the administrative process that followed any significant contact. Reports, depositions, debrief interviews, the long procedural tale of an event that would be documented and analyzed and referenced in training materials for years. She knew her name would be in those materials. She was not sure how she felt about that. She had not become a sniper to prove anything. That was not a satisfying story to tell about oneself. The narrative of the woman warrior proving herself against doubters. It was too simple and too theatrical, and it missed the actual mechanics of how she had arrived at this point. The true story was less dramatic. She had become a sniper because she was exceptionally good at a specific set of skills: patience, spatial reasoning, atmospheric mathematics, a particular quality of stillness that she had possessed since childhood, and that she had never found a better application for than the job of placing bullets at extended range with precision. What she was good at was not a statement about other people. It was just a fact about her, like her height or her blood type, or the way her hands moved when she calculated wind drift. She thought about the shape in the scope, the collapse, the 3.1 seconds of flight time that had preceded it. She did not think about this with particular emotion, not pride, not guilt. She thought about it the way she thought about all her confirmed shots, as a technical event with real consequences, requiring periodic examination to remain honest about what she did. She had saved the column. She believed that. The engagement pattern had broken in the seconds after the shot, with the clarity of a circuit being opened. The removal of the coordinating element had caused the enemy's system to fail in a predictable way, and 18 Rangers plus one attached fires asset had walked out of the Broken Ridge Pass because the system had failed in that predictable way. She also knew that she had disobeyed a direct order, and that the reasons for that disobedience, however operationally sound, did not fully erase the fact of it. That fact would sit in her record alongside the confirmed effects in the rangefinder reading and the phrase "Mountain Pass Miracle." The tension between those facts was something the Army would process through its documentation systems, and something she would carry through whatever came next in a quieter, less documented way. This was not tragedy. This was the job. The acceptance of consequences that came from making decisions under pressure when all options carried costs, and the only unacceptable option was paralysis. She heard boots behind her. Hale. He had a cup of coffee, and he offered it to her without speaking. She took it. He sat on the step beside her, and they looked at the clearing sky together, watching the stars emerge as the cloud cover continued to break apart. After a while, he said, "Why do you do it?" She knew what he was asking. Not why do you do this job in the general sense. He was 3 weeks into his first deployment, and he was not asking existential questions about military service yet. He was asking something more specific. Why had she climbed that rubble slope and lain down on frozen rock and taken a shot that no one had sanctioned against a target she could barely see? She thought about it honestly, which required sorting through multiple layers of motivation to find the one that felt most true. "Because they were my people," she said finally, "even the ones who didn't want me there." Hale was quiet for a while. He was young enough that this answer cost him something to sit with. She could see him working at it, turning it over in his mind. The idea that protection did not require welcome, that you could cover the ground of people who had not asked for your cover and who might not acknowledge it even after you provided it. He did not say anything in response. Neither did she. The conversation had reached its natural endpoint, the place where further words would add nothing and might diminish what had been said. The stars brightened as the cloud layer continued to break. The gray line of dawn appeared at the eastern ridge, not the ridge where she had taken the shot, but a different ridge, the one that marked the boundary between the night just ending and whatever came next. 72 hours later, Elena was called to the Tactical Operations Center. Macklin was there, along with Briggs and a major from division staff, whose name she did not catch, but whose presence indicated that whatever was about to happen had significance beyond the battalion level. Macklin handed her 2 documents without preamble. She read them both, taking her time, understanding that these pieces of paper represented the Army's attempt to resolve an administrative problem that had no clean solution. The first document was a recommendation for the Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an enemy of the United States. The language was formal and specific, detailing the circumstances of the engagement and the tactical impact of her actions, and the lives preserved as a result. It was signed by Macklin, by Briggs, and by Voss, whose signature appeared slightly irregular, as if he had signed with his non-dominant hand, while his dominant hand was otherwise occupied. The second document was a letter of reprimand for willful disobedience of a direct order from a commanding officer during combat operations. The language was equally formal and equally specific, detailing the communications timeline and the explicit denial of permission to engage and her decision to fire anyway. It was signed by Macklin alone. "Both go in your file," Macklin said. "Division Legal reviewed the situation and determined this is the only administratively viable approach. The medal acknowledges the tactical outcome. The reprimand acknowledges the method. They exist in your record as separate facts that are also related." He paused, and Elena understood that he was watching her reaction, trying to gauge whether she found this resolution acceptable or objectionable. "They're also asking if you'll consent to media coverage," he continued. "The distance and the conditions make this noteworthy from a public affairs perspective. There's interest in documenting the shot for recruiting purposes and general awareness of precision fire's capabilities." "No," Elena said. The word came out more firmly than she had intended, and she saw Macklin's expression shift slightly. "Sergeant," he said, using her rank to establish that this was professional conversation rather than casual discussion. "This could be significant recognition, the kind of visibility that can benefit a career." "With respect, sir, I'm declining." The major from division staff spoke for the first time. "Sergeant First Class Thorne, can I ask why?" Elena looked at him, this field-grade officer she had never met, whose job apparently included asking soldiers to explain their reluctance to be turned into public relations assets. She chose her words carefully. "Sir, if this becomes about me proving I could make a shot everyone said I couldn't make, then it becomes about ego, about vindication. And that's not what happened on that ridge." She paused, organizing her thoughts. "What happened was tactical problem-solving under pressure. I read terrain that others dismissed. I identified a threat that command did not prioritize. And when circumstances required it, I applied skills that have been used by snipers for generations. The fact that I did it at an unusual distance is mathematically interesting, but tactically incidental." She looked at Macklin, then back at the major. "If we publicize this as some kind of exceptional achievement, the message becomes that women can do extraordinary things if they try hard enough. But the actual message should be that competent people make competent decisions when given the opportunity. The distance isn't the story. The story is that I knew what needed to be done, and I did it." The major studied her for a moment. "That's a principled position, Sergeant, but you understand that turning down this kind of recognition could limit your career options going forward." "Then I'll deal with those limitations, sir." Macklin nodded slowly. "Understood. I'll inform Division that you decline media participation. The paperwork will proceed without it." He stood, and Elena understood the meeting was ending. "For what it's worth," he said, extending his hand, "you were right, and I was wrong to deny you." She shook his hand. "You were following doctrine, sir." Doctrine just hadn't caught up to the situation we were in. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe I was following assumptions I should have questioned sooner." That evening, Elena found herself in the dining facility again, the same plywood structure with the same uneven sign on the wall. The facility was quieter than usual, most of Bravo Troop having already rotated through evening chow and returned to their quarters or their duty stations. She ate alone, which suited her mood. She was halfway through her meal when Hale appeared with his tray. He hesitated for a moment, as if asking permission, and she nodded toward the seat across from her. He sat. They ate in companionable silence for several minutes. Then Hale set down his fork and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been working up the courage to ask a question. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yeah, when you were up there on that ridge, looking at that target, did you know you could make the shot?" Elena thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "I knew the math said I could. I knew the conditions were at the edge of possible. But knowing and believing are different things. So what made you pull the trigger?" She was quiet for a moment, watching the way the overhead lights reflected off the surface of her coffee. "Because the math was sound," she said, "and because Rangers were dying, and because being wrong would have cost them. But being right and not taking the shot would have cost them too." She looked at him. "So I chose to trust the math and trust myself, even when no one else did." Hale nodded slowly, processing this. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard," he said. "No, Hale. The brave thing is what you'll do next time someone tells you something's impossible. You'll remember today, and you'll check the math yourself before you believe them." At 0400 the next morning, Elena sat on the same concrete step, watching the same stars emerge from behind weather that was finally clearing for good. The air was cold and still and carried the particular clarity that came after storm systems moved through and left the atmosphere scoured clean. She thought about Corver, thought about the wind call she had missed and the consequences that had followed, thought about the weight she had carried since then, and the way that weight had shaped every calculation she made and every shot she took. She understood now that the weight would never fully leave. It was not meant to. It was the cost of doing work that mattered, where mistakes had consequences that could not be undone. But she also understood that she had done something today that Corver would have approved of. She had made the hard call, had trusted her training and her judgment when everyone around her was telling her she was wrong, had carried the burden of that decision, and would continue carrying it regardless of what medals or reprimands ended up in her file. The dawn broke over the eastern ridge, not the ridge where she had taken the shot, the other ridge, the one that marked boundaries between what had been and what would come next. The sky lightened from black to gray to the particular blue that came at high altitude when weather systems moved on and left clarity behind. In the pass below, the snow continued its work of covering and concealing. The road where they had fought, the positions where they had bled, the distances they had crossed, both measured and unmeasured, all of it being rendered invisible by weather that cared nothing for human events and proceeded according to its own physics. They denied her the cover she requested, so she climbed alone and became the cover they needed. 3,247 meters, 3.1 seconds of flight time, a bullet following mathematics that did not care about doubt or assumption or the space between what people believed possible and what actually was possible when you understood the variables deeply enough to account for them. But the longest distance was never measured in meters. It was measured in the space between dismissed and indispensable, between attachment and Ranger, between who they thought she was and who she proved herself to be through action rather than argument. The mountains kept their silence as they always did, as they always would, holding their secrets and their dead and their stories in stone that would outlast all the people who passed through these valleys carrying their brief, violent purposes. The snow would melt eventually. The spring would come. The pass would look different under different light. But some things would remain. The ballistic data in a file somewhere, documenting that on a particular day, in a particular place, under particular conditions, a sergeant first class had placed a round on target at a distance that pushed against the edge of what the human nervous system could achieve when combined with precision engineering and mathematical certainty. And somewhere in that same file, a letter of reprimand documenting that the same sergeant first class had disobeyed a direct order to achieve that result. Both facts true, both facts permanent, both facts existing in tension that would never fully resolve because some things could not be resolved, only acknowledged and carried forward. Elena Thorne stood and picked up her rifle case and walked toward the airfield where helicopters would soon arrive to take them out of these mountains and back to the forward operating base, and eventually back to wherever soldiers went when the immediate fighting was done and the longer process of documentation and recovery began. Behind her, the pass was white and clean and still. The longest distance measured not in the space a bullet traveled, but in the space between doubt and trust, between isolation and belonging, between the person she had been when she arrived and the person she was becoming, with each decision made under pressure, when all the easy options had already been exhausted. The mountains watched her go with the indifference of geology. And when the sound of her boots on snow had faded, and the helicopters had come and gone, and the weather had covered even the traces of their landing, the mountains returned to their silence, keeping their accounting in stone and ice and the thin, cold air where mathematics and human will had intersected for 3.1 seconds and changed everything that came after.